Lovely to see you all here. Some familiar faces. But, what was it that Manto said? अगर आपको मेरी कहानियाँ बर्दाश्त नहीं होती हैं, तो आपको मतलब समाज भी नहीं बर्दाश्त होना चाहिए. When I read Siddharth's book, that was the first thing that occurred to me. And the second thing is what you've also written, that good poetry is better than bad journalism. Good fiction is 1,000 times better than whatever passes for journalism in India currently. And this is not just good fiction, it's fantastic. And I'll tell you why. Because it really is, it's like a chronicle of our times, what we're going through individually as a country. It's like a potted history of the last century, over a century. And it also, I was just telling Siddharth that I was reading the review by Abraham Verghese in the New York Times, and he says that after you finish this, you expect to be depressed because there's so much that is to, be depressed about India currently, regardless of Chandrayaan. Sorry, and I'm a patriot and I'm a nationalist, etc. These days you have to make all these qualifying statements. But there's so much to be depressed about, and yet there's something very uplifting about the book. And I think it is the quality of being able to record the times that we're in such brilliant and sometimes hallucinatory, as everyone has said, but sometimes hallucinations are the only way to get through life. And one of the many strains in this book, apart from the monkey man, is also opium. And I can see why one has to sometimes resort to taking large doses of it if you have to get through this life. But really fantastic work, and I congratulate you for it. And I wonder how much of it was based on your own research, especially during The Beautiful and the Damned. I saw a lot of echoes of it in this book. It's just marvelous, but talk about how much of it was really a result of that as well.
Well, thank you, Kaveree.
Many things.
And yes, many things to talk about. And thank you all for being here. This is the last event of the India busy summer tour. So I'm glad to be wrapping it up. The last book, which some of you may know and some of you may not, was nonfiction and was a work of reported nonfiction, long form, and that's one of the hats that I wear. I do what I like to think is very carefully researched and reported and fact-checked long form writing. And of course, the book ran into trouble with a lawsuit against it before it was even published in India. And it had to be published in India without the first chapter, which was a kind of badge of honor for me. We did eventually win that lawsuit, and now the book is in full, available in full. But this novel is, on the one hand, yes, it does come from my engagement with this country through narrative nonfiction, through reporting, which I've continued to do. And I take some pride in the fact that I get very close to the ground. I know, even though I have now lived in New York for a long time, I pride myself that I go to places where maybe many of you do not usually go because it doesn't take you there. And but at the same time, this novel is a departure. This novel basically tries to do what nonfiction can't do. So my nonfiction, even though the person who brought the lawsuit would disagree, it's bound by facts. It's journalism, so it's bound by facts. It's reporting. You quote only what a person has said. You don't misquote him, whether you dislike that person or not. You are bound by the facts. At least that's what I do in my journalism. And I have my own opinions in my journalism, but I don't hide them from the reader. They know this is coming from the reporter, This is very clear. But the novel is a more elusive, a more free kind of space. So in some sense, it is about the places where the nonfiction can't go. Yes, it's informed by my reporting in Bhopal, in the Northeast, in Delhi, and my living in Delhi, my life in Delhi. I lived here for many years as a journalist. But it adds many new strands to it that are much more inventive. It is a novel. It goes into the minds of characters that I might not necessarily like in real life, but in a novel you choose to do that. You choose to go into the head of somebody whose politics might be completely different from yours, because it's interesting. It's interesting to explore interior human lives. So yeah, it's a big departure from me, and that's one of the reasons it took a long time.
Yeah, how long did it take you?
It took people say, I think I was very annoyed in the US. One of the pre-pub reviews said, it has been 15 years since his last novel, which is true. But, in between there was a non-fiction book, and, which was significant. And, it took about seven summers. I also have a full-time job. I teach creative writing in New York City, and that is a full-time job. I do journalism, I write, I do a lot of other writing. So this was really over 7 summers. It sounds big when you say 7 years, but it's not like 7 into 12. It's just like 3 months in the summer over 7 years. But it's a big book in scope because it's set slightly in the near future. In a near future where India has done more than the moon landing. The moon landing is passing to be. In this near future, there's a piloted Mars mission, which has been successful. But, set slightly in a near future, slightly alternate kind of Delhi. But, it goes back in time to the Sepoy Rebellion. It goes back in time to 1857, as far back as 1857.
After the rebellion, in fact, 1859.
Yes.
Yeah. So I love that, the time travel in the book, and I think that is truly magnificent, the way you're able to do that. But my favorite part has to be the part about Delhi, and the area that you talk about. It's so familiar, when you talk about the Munirka flats, and you talk about the complete contradiction of those malls, and the slums next door. And, it's so familiar. You talk about the whole of the Priya complex being sort of depopulated because everything has migrated to the malls. It's so much a part of what Delhi life is and South Delhi life is. And you can sense that it's someone who's lived there, who knows it. BB's character, Moy's character, they're people that we may have met and just sort of overlooked. Talk a little about creating these brilliant, brilliant women. And BB especially, who I really actually ended up just adoring her. I think she's, you think that she's sort of just going through life in this cloudy haze, and then eventually she is the one who, sort of recalls her own moral compass at the end.
I think that's a really, really wonderful summary of her, and so I'm very glad you read her that way, because she's probably my favorite character.
She is, isn't she?
But she took a long time to write. I mean, partly because even though Bibi is the character at the beginning of the novel, and she's the main narrative, the main character. She's a journalist, but she's a former journalist, and she has stopped being a journalist. She's kind of, when you pick up the novel with her, she's in her 40s. She's failing in her mind, and not just in her mind, in the mind of everybody else around her. Because she's single, she doesn't have children, she's not married, she's nothing. And obviously I am very drawn to somebody like that, and she herself is very critical of herself. She is somebody who had a lot of courage in the past and now feels like she no longer has any courage. She's just drifting through her days with this kind of slightly dead-end job. But I'm very, very always attracted to protagonists who are kind of on the margins, who are kind of inside, outside. And Bibi is, of course, very located in Delhi and Munirka, but she's also not from Delhi. She's, she has this whole Kolkata, Northeast, and, there are these layers to her past.
She could be you, but she couldn't be as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know what Flaubert said when they asked Flaubert who is Madame Bovary. Flaubert said, c'est moi. I am Madame Bovary. I might be a man, but I am Madame Bovary. And I think that it can be true of writing. Although this has some of my students in the US, they challenge this. You can't write about anybody except yourself. And I say, but I have like 100 selves, But yeah, Bibi took a long time coming because she's the most important character and the most important strand that ties the whole thing together. And, it took a lot of false starts, but there was a point at which I think I really entered her headspace and she came alive for me. And yeah, she shares little bits from me, absolutely. But I think fiction has its own. Fiction is very different from journalism. Journalism is very. I love both, but Bibi had these dreams that I wasn't sure why she was having them, and I had to write to find out what was happening. Yeah.
And Moy's character, I mean, she's so tragic in her ambition, and you feel so strongly for her. You want her to succeed, but you know that she's going nowhere, right? And this whole idea that, the way you even categorize the foreigners in her life, the English speaking, then the non-English speaking, then the Spanish who turns out to be a Colombian. And I mean, it's so sad, but it's true.
Yeah, I mean, she's again like a character that I really like. So, I mean, there is all this thing like, what are you supposed to be interested in as a writer? Where do you draw from? And it's really fascinating to me, like for me, the Bibi and Moy friendship was very important. And I suppose...
As much as Bibi and Sanjeet, which
yes,
we come to.
yeah.
But Bibi and Moy is also very interesting.
Yeah, because female friendship is something that women writers do very well.
Yeah.
And, Elena Ferrante is the best example of that. And, I've read Ferrante in great detail. And it's very funny. In New York, I once did an event on Ferrante, which the publisher asked, and I was the only man, along with Anne Goldstein, who's a translator. And although, audience said, why, most of whom were women, why are you interested in Ferrante? I said, Ferrante is really interesting to me. I'm not, and, female friendship is something I'm very interested in. I'm also very interested in mother-daughter dynamics and seeing it in all its complexity. And so Bibi was very important to me because it really allowed me to go into new areas in fiction. And the friendship, because they're such opposites, Moy and Bibi are such opposites, and yet in some ways they are friends because they're opposites. Moy allows Bibi to take some weight off her shoulder because she is so not interested in the things that Bibi is interested in, right? Climate change, politics, state of the world. And Moy is like, I just want to get out of India and I just want to marry a white man and have a solitaire, ring and 2 perfect children and a foreign passport. Yeah. And they're such opposites, and yet there is a kind of tenderness between in the friendship. And I enjoyed writing it, and I hope it just comes through for the reader.
It does. And of course, the book is also very cheeky. Not to suggest that it's a very depressing book. You'll recognize a lot of characters, let me tell you. I did. Some of which...
all characters are all resemblance to individuals or corporations or entities or governments are purely fictional.
Of course. Therefore, there is an Ombani. And there is a certain virus, which has a certain name.
Yes.
And there is a certain editor whose name is mentioned. And there is a certain column whose name is also mentioned. And a certain glossy-haired anchor who keeps screaming at everybody. So these are people that we will recognize.
And a certain lawsuit filed in Assam.
Yes. So I don't want to put him into trouble again, but you will recognize them. And if please don't mention it to people. And you please escape quickly before somebody does. Because you don't know in these days, when you were writing it, because there's so much self-censorship that is going on. And someone who's, not to laugh about it, because someone who's actually faced the trouble and the harassment, the sheer harassment of, a lawsuit, writing about the truth in India, even in fiction, is not funny.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But when I was writing the book, and this is something I always tell people, that if I thought about these things, I would freeze. And you have to write as if you are completely free to write whatever it is that you want to write. You have to at least begin that way. And so I did that. I wasn't thinking about publishers. I wasn't thinking about whether the book will find, maybe the book will not find a publisher in India. Maybe the book will not find a publisher in the West. One doesn't know. But you have to live as if you are free, even if you are not, at least some of the time. And this novel is really about that how do you live free some of the time when you are in a very unfree world? And the names were like little jokes. You're absolutely right. And therefore,
I love them.
it's for some people. And there are lots of clues sprinkled through the book, and there are different levels. So there are some Delhi jokes, Delhi clues, but then there are also these larger sort of about literature and film and things. Much more very, it's a very playful novel at the end of the day, and so there are clues for people who love film. And there are clues for people who love journalism at Delhi, at the Northeast, and report and literature. So that was fun to do because it's a big novel. You have to keep yourself engaged and interested while you're doing it.
In fact, one of the things I'd like Kartika to do, if she can, is actually release a sort of audio along with the book, because the poetry, the songs, whether it's fairs or whether it's Aga Shahid Ali, just the idea of maybe him reciting all these, and I would request you to recite at least one of them tonight, would be fantastic and also informative, for people. So his acknowledgements is really like my bibliography. And I would urge everyone to read that as well. And to, they used to have those lyrics booklets with cassettes back in the day when people like me were growing up. You need to attach something like that to the book. And, it really will be lovely because, whether it's Bekar Kutte or Aga Shahid Ali, you sort of get so much of that, no?
There is a essay I did for an American site, which is the playlist for this novel, which will give you some of the questions that you're raising. And a wonderful Westland Atri has made a Spotify playlist, which she played in Calcutta for the event. So there is a playlist, and there's an essay on the playlist.
I was being original.
No, it's a great question. We were just anticipating your demands.
Back and forth, like 1984, the Bhopal gas tragedy, as it's called. Even the way we have termed our news headlines seems so silly, and seems so much received conventional wisdom when you read this book. Bhopal, there's 1947, there's 1859, and that the 1859 to me is the most fascinating, and the lady of the 56 knives and the white Mughal. I mean, these are such characters, and of course, Sykes and Colonel Sleeman. They're all based in history. Talk about that research as well.
Sure. I mean, this is definitely not a historical novel.
It isn't, but you get a sense.
It will not help you pass your civil service exams. It will not make you, it will not allow you to win some quiz show anywhere. Or, but it is, of course, filled with kind of research, but research done in a kind of playful, irreverent kind of way. There is great writing, and not just writing, but also cinema on certain parts of Indian history, like 1947, both in Punjabi, in Urdu, in Bengali. There is a lot of great work. And similarly on 1857 and the aftermath, the late 19th century, there's a lot of great work, historical work, non-fiction, fiction. But the novel is very playful, and one of the things it deliberately does is it's not a strictly realist novel. It's constantly deviating from the realism into more speculative areas like science fiction, like conspiracy, like noir. So what the 1850, the 19th century section, okay, I did go to graduate school in a comparative literature, PhD in comparative literature at Columbia University. I don't talk about my credentials. I hate credentialing. But I did a minor in 19th century, in the late 19th century. So I read, but that was like 20 years ago. I read a lot of historical work, and it all percolated in. But essentially what I was trying to do with the 19th century, I was trying to do many things. But one of the things I said is that why has no Indian, to my knowledge, why has nobody ever written a Western novel set in the Himalayas? Yes. Because I also live in the United States, so I also read great writers like Cormac McCarthy, people who write these westerns. And one of the things, the western is very masculine, it's very macho, it's very colonial, but it's also very interested in the landscape and borders and things like that. And I just said to myself, I am going to write an Eastern. I am going to write a novella set right after the Sepoy Rebellion, which is about a bunch of white men with guns and horses tracking down a fugitive from the rebellion in the Himalayas. And instead of the soundtrack in my hand, instead of a banjo, it'll be a sitar. Why has nobody done this? It's time. It's like the 21st century. It's time to try new things. So I said I was going to write a Western Eastern. And that is, but it's a Western Eastern with also slightly science fiction, speculative, steampunk. So it's a very playful, all the sections, even though they are about very dark moments in history. I think that's where the pleasure, I want to give pleasure to the reader. And yes, I was trying to write a Western, an Eastern.
In fact, to me, this is already a series in my mind, and somebody has to option it because it's so cinematic, the way you write it. And even the end is so beautiful. So there are like these 5 episodes, so somebody has to just come and shoot it now. So quickly, please put it up for optioning. The monkey man reappears,
yes.
Sometimes as a hybrid of a monkey and a tiger, sometimes as... What is that obsession?
It's again a kind of Delhi. It's like it's a bit of a
urban legend.
Urban legend, and again, you have great American writers like Thomas Pynchon who've done great work with the urban legends of New York. And I was like, why does the New Delhi Monkey Man deserves more respect?
Yes, Delhi Che. Remember there was a movie about it as well.
Right.
Yeah, Delhi 6.
So I wanted to play with that, but urban legend, conspiracies, alternative worlds, visions, these are things that the novel is interested in. But, ultimately also the New Delhi Monkey Man goes to the heart of one of the concern in this novel. The novel is very interested in, it's very opposed to purity. It's very opposed to fixed boundaries, whether they be between men and women or human beings and animals or between, human beings and artificial intelligence or India and Pakistan or India and Bangladesh, It's very between viruses and, it's very interested in the fluidity, the porousness of boundaries. And it's interested in asking questions that, does it always have to be a relationship of violence if somebody is different, if something is different? Or can it be more complex? Can it be more symbiotic than that? And the New Delhi Monkey Man, just the 4 letters are perfect. You've got a city and you've got an animal and you've got a human being and it's encapsulated. And it was like the perfect sort of micro story for the novel for me. And again, I had great fun. It's composed almost entirely from news reports, from actual news reports that came out at the time, but they are forgotten, right? And I wanted to resurrect it. But it's composed like some of the details about the motorcycle helmet, whether the monkey man is 4 feet or 8 feet tall. These are composed of actual news reports. It's almost like a collage technique that I used, and I had great fun with it.
And there's so many things that you recognize. The Burari, the weird Burari murders. I mean, whatever, the suicides, murders, whatever you want to call them. There's so many things you recognize in this that have echoes, and obviously a lot of research has gone into it, and it must have just stayed at the back of your head, and I think when you were writing it, all that just came out, right?
Yeah, I mean, you take it, it's almost a love letter to Delhi, to Munirka, to various things.
Poor Munirka must have never had a love letter that has been written so elegantly, must be thinking, what have I done to deserve it? And actually, if you look at it, it really is between, it's between 2 worlds, the malls and the Munirka village.
The village, exactly.
Yeah, so it really is Delhi.
Yeah, it's a liminal space, and I'm always interested in liminal characters, liminal spaces, in between. Again, it's like against the idea of hard, fixed boundaries. Right. But you're right. I mean, you picked up on a lot of the Delhi details. But they stayed in my head, I guess. It's not that I was even consciously researching. I'm just connected to things that happen here. And not just Delhi, but also the Northeast.
Yeah, which I'm not so familiar with, so perhaps I've not caught that much.
But they just percolate down,
Yeah.
and then they emerge. And I think as a writer, that's one of the things that's fun to do, especially doing fiction. You have to give yourself permission. You train your unconscious to speak itself, which is kind of complicated because the unconscious is not like training. But that's what it's like, this complicated thing, and you let it come out from inside. And I'm really happy that you picked up on all these little.
I wish I knew a little more of your other worlds. And also, I'd like you to read some bits as well. But that part, where I think it's Bibi talking to herself when she says, "Who remembers you? Who will forget you?" I mean, it's so sad, and it's such a solitary feeling. And sometimes, I mean, you do feel like that, isn't it? In this really strange city, which is constantly in some kind of haze in your book, and it's true. Whether it's the mist or whether it's the virus, whatever. There's some kind of thing going on in the air, right?
Yeah, and I think some of my New York. I mean, it's not just Delhi. I mean, I think. We sometimes feel that, big cities have all these opportunities, all these people, but they can be tremendously lonely places, especially now with the pandemic, post-pandemic, social media, work makes it, all these things. So I think there's sometimes a kind of an epidemic of loneliness in cities, and Bibi Bibi does feel herself trapped in that. To some degree.
Talk a little about Mohinder. I found him quite fascinating. He of the one arm. Again, really, quite an amazing character. Talk a little about him.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to explain these obsessions. I mean, there's been, for some reason, I knew a lot of men when I was in India, in Calcutta, and in Delhi, who had lost an arm. They were usually subaltern, they were usually Dalit, usually they had either lost it in farming or in an accident at the factory. Right. And I think these things stayed with me because I wasn't consciously trying to create a kind of disabled character, but I was very struck by how people, I have known people like that, and some of them quite well, actually. And so that was part of it. Part of it was, as I said, it's a love letter to the past, to these things that I've known, people I've known, and trying to bring it back. But then Mohinder became much more than just a man who doesn't have an arm. And at a certain point, it's not even clear if he's entirely, what is he? Is he, But, again, I was blurring the lines between realism and occult, ghost stories. He just seemed to me, again, just we talked about the relationship between Bibi and Moi. Mohinder has a level of experience that Bibi doesn't, so it allowed me to bring in a certain kind of male underclass, working class, factory labor, exploitation into the novel, which I really wanted to do, but not in an entirely social realist kind of way, but slightly hallucinatory way, because Mohinder also has a lot of experience. He's like an India traveler. Right. But that was also based a little bit on the research that I did for the beautiful damned migrant workers. Migrant workers, they would tell you they go all over the place. Yeah. They're like, I was in the steel factory in Goa, and then I was in the Dhaga.
We saw during the pandemic.
Right. I mean, exactly. And again, I wanted to give that a kind of a narrative, a space within the novel. So it's all these things came together in Mohinder.
Right. The Calcutta bit is, again, fascinating to me, having a little bit of experience of Calcutta, but not as deep as yours. And the savage Freud, which you say you've taken from Ashish Nandi to a great extent. Talk a bit about that doctor. He's quite fascinating to me.
So Ashish actually came to the book launch event at IIC. I don't know I don't think he's read the novel. So but I don't know what I told him that a little bit of the novel is inspired by him. But I think Ashinandi is a really brilliant thinker, really brilliant South Asian thinker, and very, very sort of,
so sort of dimensional,
right.
no?
Yeah. And
disciplinary is
yes,
it's called.
I mean, he's a very original kind of thinker, and I love the collection of essays called The Savage Freud, and one of the essays in there is about the first Indian psychoanalyst who was a Bengali, Dr. Girindra Shekhar Bose, in the 1940s in Kolkata, in the 1940s. And I was just interested in why is India, again, this question is it's like, why is the Indian novel in English sometimes so straight-laced? And I have myself been straight-laced. Why can't we do a Western and an Eastern? Or why can't we have psychoanalysis in Kolkata? Because it clearly existed.
Yeah. Fingerprinting was discovered in America in Calcutta as a crime I found out.
Absolutely.
See? It's useful for IAS aspirants after all.
Yeah.
We are too old, but others.
And fingerprinting comes from a kind of pre-colonial technique of identification that was common in both India and China. It is just that the British, that they classified it. So all that is in there. So Calcutta is very interesting to me, and the Ashish Nandi essay was very interesting to me, but I don't know if he will approve of what I have done, because, this psychoanalyst became a slightly menacing, slightly complex character.
I'm sure he would have enjoyed it.
I took elements from, Ashish Nandi's essay, like the fact that, this man apparently had an obsession of washing his hands with antiseptic before every session. That was a great detail. Or that he had been interested in yoga and mesmerism as well as psychoanalysis. So to a novelist, these things are incredible material. And he just became this character that my main character, Das, is sort of, who's very hapless in certain ways, who's a young man. And he just feels that he's caught up in this sort of, these people who have a sense, a greater sense of the world of knowledge, whether it's psychoanalysis or it's about ancient texts. And it was a fun novella to write, and I kind of imagined this Calcutta of the 1940s that is very slow and graceful, and the trams move, very gracefully. Yeah, and again, it's obviously influenced by my reading of also not just Ashish Nandi but Bengali literature, like Bomkesh Bokshi, for instance. So a lot of that goes into this Calcutta section.
This bit when you say that when you talk of BB's quote, for instance, you say makes you think of Ray adaptations of Tagore, Gogol stories, a court to be lonely in London, a court to challenge arrogant czarist officers, a court always to take you home in Brooklyn, through a kindly stranger. I think that's how you end. Just that quote has so much of what you've read and what the book is about, really. Just to think an inanimate object has such character.
Yeah, well, in Indian, in the Indian imagination, before globalization, to go into the West was this great thing. And it's largely a kind of a masculine thing, like it's the men who will go to London, right? But the whole thing is if you go to London or to Germany to work, you'll be very cold. Yeah. And so you will need a long black coat. Right. And there is this amazing scene in Charulata where they are imagining in the film, in the Ray film, a version of Charulata, where they're talking about this character will go to London. And, in Bengali the line is, Tumi kalo overcoat pore hatbe. And there is this whole fantasy of the black overcoat that exists among Bengalis, among Punjabis, people who have migrated in the earlier diaspora. I just switched that to Bibi because she's also a woman. Right. And I had fun with that because, again, I said, she's going to have this black overcoat and so is going to have this, it's almost like a weapon. Right. But I have fun with these things, absolutely. And
Sanjeet could have been you.
I don't know if I should say that. I don't think so. I think I'm not as half as courageous a journalist as he is. I mean, maybe he has little bits of me, especially when he drinks other people's alcohol without
That's all journalists. Come on, that's a birthright.
without cracking a smile, so much as cracking a smile.
I love that.
Drank
that he-
copious amounts of
amounts.
other people's liquor and left.
Really struck home. So I was just wondering how much of Sanjeet is really a lot of journalists now.
Yeah, but he's also...
Maybe some of your friends as well.
yeah, exactly.
I can mention a couple, but I won't. Who are in the acknowledgements.
Right. Yeah, no, you always take bits and pieces from people who exist and some who don't to make a character.
But could you explain a little of Sanjeet to the audience, which of course will read the book. You better read the book. But talk a little about him. Because he's really he's the elusive thing, no, that Bibi is looking for. He's the person that who drives her.
Yeah, so he's a muckraking journalist who falls out of the whole India shining, the boom in India, because the stories that he's writing are always critical. And he goes further down the ladder. And this is a bit disturbing to me, the way some of the things in the book just sort of react with reality. Yeah. Because, when the book came out in New York in the end of May, it was released in the US, and my friends in New York were complaining that reading this novel is triggering them because the air quality in New York for the first week of June was like the air quality described here. And I said, get used to it, suffer. But now, of course, there's a lot of talk about Manipur. And what is interesting in the novels is that Sanjeet is Meitei and Moi is Kuki. So, but Sanjeet is like, again, this is taken from the work of, there are incredible journalists in India. And some of them don't practice journalism full on anymore because it's become very hard to do it. The media organizations don't exist. But, I was always struck by the violence in the Northeast and how it kind of was easily forgotten. And Sanjeet is one of the stories that he's doing is about these encounter killings in Manipur, which are based, and, my colleague and friend, Kishalai Bhattacharjee, has written very well. So Kishalai, has written about it, has done, among others. But I was just struck by how these things are forgotten, including the grisly details. And Sanjeet is somebody who is uncovering these stories and then is eventually himself disappeared until maybe he is not disappeared. Yeah.
For that, we have to read the book. The idea that a corpse in India is more valuable than a living being. And your corpses, again, it's one of those things that keep recurring. A corpse is disguised as a terrorist, a corpse is described as an Ghuspetia. That's again something that recurs. It's harrowing, but it's true.
Well, that's one of the threads running through all the sections, because that's true of the colonial section. I mean, if you read accounts of the Sepoy Rebellion, which again, we don't do it sufficiently, I mean, you read these accounts of corpses stuffed into wells of Indian sepoys, and the thing is that the head count or the body count is an old colonial mechanism, and it was true in the United States. There's again this whole mythology that the Native Americans would scalp settlers, but it's actually the opposite was true. Settlers were given money for bringing, $1 per scalp for bringing back evidence of a dead indigenous person.
Scorsese has done very well in The Killers of the Flower.
Right, and Cormac McCarthy, writes about it brilliantly. He's an American novelist I very much like and who's an influence. But you see that in colonial times. But there's this whole thing with counting bodies, and again, as a journalist, with policing and army, there is always this thing: how many were killed? It's like a football score, but with much darker, and there is always this thing with bodies, and the novel is constantly playing with that. And one of the occult things that's happening in the novel is that people are always having trouble counting the bodies. Whether they are police or whether they are soldiers, they kill for a very specific reason. That if you have one body, it will get you X number of points and a bonus. But then, so you only kill as many as you need to. This is not made up. This is based on facts. But then the part that is made up is that then they have trouble counting the bodies. It's like, is it 11 or is it 13 or is it 12?
And what happened to the one that disappeared?
Exactly. And, that is, again, one of the ways in which the novel is kind of playing with the idea that maybe counting is not the way to understand humanity and its complexity and the relationship between people. And that goes back to our current dispensation and things like the NRC or the CAA, that just classifying and counting people. And this is not just India. I say the same thing in America, the United States. This is happening. It's kind of quite a global phenomenon, and I am very, very critical of it because some people are individuals and others are just numbers, and I find that morally objectionable. And this book. But it's not doing it in a direct, rhetorical kind of way. It's just playing with it.
Yeah, right. And I think Bibi's Aadhaar card again is a running theme,
It's
in the book.
Yeah, it's a very futuristic Aadhaar card.
Yeah, very much. In fact, talk a little about this futuristic bit, which is quite fascinating to me. I'm not a great sci-fi buff, but I found it quite fascinating. This constant, what is now, what is future.
So I didn't want Indian readers to read it as a direct account of the present. And of course, it doesn't matter what the writer wants, because readers are free, just like writers are free to make their own interpretations. But I said, I didn't want them to think that, he's directly commenting on this and that and that. I am, but at the same time, I'm also... So one of my problems was the pandemic. Because I finished the book before the pandemic, and there is a flu in Delhi where people are walking around wearing masks, and it's a bird flu, which they are saying has come from China. And I got really irritated when the pandemic happened. And I said, now people will think, he wrote it during the pandemic and just put in the flu. I said, no, this is from before. Yeah. But, so it's a future where waves of epidemics happen, serial waves of demonetization have happened. There has been a piloted Mars landing. I will not tell you more. But I wanted to keep it very low-key in the background. So it's a little bit like our Delhi, but a little bit alternate, a little bit near future. And, I thought about it whether to make it more overt. But, it's not science fiction, but it's just crossing science fiction and realism. But there are lots of slightly weird things throughout the book, like, for instance, how Bibi finally gets a card. Yeah. I don't want to tell you about that. No, you have to read it to find out, but it's not like she goes to a government office or some official booth. It happens in a slightly uncanny way. And, again, I wanted the reader to have a little distance between the present and the story that I'm writing. But of course, reality keeps catching up. So then you have it starts. You have a pandemic, and then this happens and that happens. Yeah.
I think as a novelist whose ear is so close to the ground, I think you can't help it. You probably are anticipating a lot of things that are happening, and by the time you write it, I guess it looks dated, but it's not.
Yeah.
The other thing, I love this. India is not a nation, but a prison house of possible nations. I think that's quite a statement.
Yeah, it's not something that I'm quoting somebody I interviewed, and I can't name the person because that person is in prison.
Oh.
So
a little bit like what's happening at Ashoka, an IB probe on a paper about democratic backsliding in the country, which proves the point.
Yeah, it's terrible, but it's very. I also laughed when I heard about the IB men showing up because I realized that, in my first novel, there are two IB men who show up at this veterinarian's office saying, "Why have you taken these Danish men around to see this dairy farm?" And he said, "Because it's funded by the Danish government, and it's a government farm." And he said, "Do you not know that there's a helicopter base, a military base right next to the dairy farm?" And The character says, it's not my fault. I didn't choose to have the government chose to put the dairy farm next to the military base. But yeah, I've always had these slightly weird agents of the state showing up.
Showing up in some way, yeah. And they show up at Amidala as well, right?
Yes,
They're
yes,
very
yes.
strange people.
Yes, yes.
Apart from the monkey man, the other thing that struck me was the dogs which have become fat on the bodies of babies and half-eaten arms, where when you talk about Mohinder's hospital, it's terrifying, but again, it's true.
Yeah, I mean, if you just read any newspaper on a regular basis, you read about this. And I'm sorry, I do have a slightly, I grizzly temperament. There's always, it's like, yeah, it's there. But if you pick up the newspapers, very sadly, but it's fiction, so so it's not just the dogs, and there are other possibilities to dogs, which you find out in the Bhopal section.
Yeah, that's true. I wanted to read a bit of this. Which part do you think you want to read? And then I'm also going to ask you to recite either the Aga Shahid Ali or the Faiz.
I did not bring those. I did not bring those with me, though. So we might have to skip.
Whatever you wish, actually. But do read something, please.
Okay, I actually picked out a little section for. I always do different sections for each audience. It's very short, so don't worry. People have a lot of patience here, which I find fascinating. I'm used to New York, where 25 minutes, everybody is done.
Yeah. We're very decent people.
Yeah.
Love talking.
Okay. So, very short section from the BB section of the novel, but it's not set in Delhi because that's too familiar to all of you. So I always try to do slightly unfamiliar. Just a little bit. When BB's in actually Calcutta with her mother.
Yeah. Who's always complaining, like most mums.
On the last evening of Bibi's stay in Calcutta, Bibi's mother brings out an old iPad. Bibi's hope when she gave her mother the iPad was that they would use video chat, closing the distance between Calcutta and Delhi. But her mother found the technology too challenging, and Bibi, after a few days of hopeless tutoring, lost patience. Yet now her mother seems surprisingly capable as she opens a browser and pulls up an article on the BBC website. The article is about a distant cousin of Bibi's in Guwahati. Bibi does not remember this cousin. From what her mother says, he is a man who has done well in recent years, although he too is haunted by the possibility of his name featuring on the D list. He owns a car and a flat in a housing complex that has recently come up on the outskirts of the city. His children go to a private school and his wife runs a beauty parlor. Bibi nods as her mother offers these details and reads the article, which describes how one afternoon, just as her cousin was about to get into his new car on the ground floor garage of his new flat, he was attacked by a leopard. Disoriented, the leopard had fled through the streets of Guwahati, she reads. It ran into a politician's victory procession. Lotus flower banners waved in the breeze, and men symbolically slashed the air with hangdang swords, chanting that they would send D citizens back to Bangladesh or to their graves. When the leopard manifested, pausing in its panicked but graceful run, the politicians' bodyguards opened jittery fire with their short carbines. Bullets ricocheted off the cars and embedded themselves in the plaster and concrete of new construction. Bullets missed the leopard, missed a D citizen foolhardily enough to come near this procession, missed those wanting to send D citizens back to Bangladesh or to their graves. The leopard ran for cover, seeking refuge in the dark ground floor garage of Bibi's cousin's building, flattening itself out under the chassis of his ocean blue Honda Aspire. The BBC page carries a photo of the encounter, taken from a security camera in the garage. Both leopard and man look equally terrified.
The leopard is rising on its hind legs, its forepaws reaching out towards Bibi's cousin in a frantic sweep. Its jaws are wide open, its nostril flaring. She can see the fear in her cousin's eyes as he tries to defend himself, his scalp already bleeding from the gash opened up by the leopard's right paw. His fists are up, his right leg raised in what looks like an effort to kick at the leopard. There is a curious symmetry to their postures, a mirroring that transcends their species difference. But there is a divide between them for all that. Some tremendous abyss on whose opposite sides they stand, even when in such apparently close proximity. Bibi's cousin has intruded into the leopard's world, yet the surroundings, the unpainted concrete walls, and the drab coffins of metal parked around them suggest that it is the leopard who is the trespasser, that it does not belong on this planet, that it is marooned here. Bibi's mother talks about her cousin's injuries. Bibi keeps looking at the leopard. She feels its exhaustion and its rage, feels the smell of human blood in her nostrils, as if like a character from one of those tales set in the Sundarbans, she herself is turning into a leopard.
Wonderful. So, if you'd like to ask any questions, I think we do have a little time. I do, of course, ask you to read the book. You'll be better placed to ask those questions. But if there's anything that anyone wants to ask.
And I particularly like writing questions, how to write, craft questions. Not that I could help you, but if you have doubts, I particularly like those.
How do you write? Do you write in longhand or do you write on a laptop? Or no, but what has this tour been like? Are you coming back after a while, or have you been here, or are you coming back after the pandemic?
No. I am always here, but right. I'm here below the radar. I was in Ayodhya. Before all this last year, I was in Assam. I've written for various publications. I'm in Delhi, but I'm never public when I'm here as a writing. So I've never done a book event in India. So this is my first. I've done one book event for my first novel back in 2003, and that was it. Because I don't like to be very public.
Right.
But I decided that this book was special, and so I've been doing this for a month. And my fun part, the best part has been going into Barisans or all the bookshops here, and they say, "Sir, come." They're great. The booksellers have been one of the best parts of the book tour. And I say, I've been coming here for years, but I don't introduce myself. I just buy my books quietly and I disappear. They were like, "Why did you not tell us that you come here?"
Right.
So it's actually been great fun to be.
Which cities have you visited?
Most of my time has been spent in Delhi, which other cities have complained about. Delhi has been a lot, and then Kolkata, Chennai, and Bangalore.
Kartika has been making you work very hard.
No complaints. There have been complaints from the Northeast and Shillong, especially Shillong, why I am not there.
Right.
But we will hopefully take care of that at some other point in the future. Because
you've reported on Manipur as well, and everybody has suddenly, unfortunately, rediscovered Manipur.
Very unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. So talk a bit about that. It's just.
I have a lot of very wonderful friends who are journalists and writers here, and some of them have been reporting from the ground. So I did, and they said, you should come, but I'm not. I'm like, this novel has taken it's taken all my attention. So I don't want to say anything about Manipur, except that I think, you see these conditions of civil war that, in some sense, in Manipur, it sounds like almost like civil war.
But it basically is this sort of divide that has just runs through this country, and it erupts and explodes in place to place, and we are always like reacting to what is happening. Obviously, I find it very disturbing, and this novel does kind of take that on. But, I haven't been there recently, so it would not be, there are some great reporters, some great journalists who are doing fantastic work.
One of the particularly venal characters in the book is Anand. And he is actually symbolic of many who have, in a way, climbed the greasy pole, if you were to call it that, in this city, right? And other cities, but Delhi especially, I think, lends itself to such greasy pole climbers. Can you explain how many Anands are there out there? And I wonder if it's based on someone who actually I can quite recognize.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know. To be honest, of course, Anand is from Delhi, but he's made his name in New York, right? So there are people like that in New York and London. I meet people like that in not often, because I don't move much in those circles. But that kind of climbing is an aspect of our times, a very disturbing aspect of our times, because such people, flourish in some sense. But
And there's no morality.
It is about success based purely in material terms. But to be honest, although Anand is from Delhi, I was satirizing, a character, but he's a kind of a composite and partly a fictional character. He's completely a fictional character, but a composite of certain things. But there are people like that in New York and London. One meets them all the time. Sometimes they are actually from Delhi, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they are actually from elsewhere. Because these are great concentrations of power and wealth, and I think it's very seductive. And you feel that you must be climbing, you must be rising constantly.
Yeah, otherwise you'll be left behind like Bibi.
Exactly, right? Exactly. That's very well put.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be a Bibi. You want to be, and you don't want to be a Moy either.
Right.
You don't want to be an appendage. You want to be Anand.
And you don't want to be Sanjit either. But so those are the choices in this world, and I guess the novel is partly about trying to figure out what's possible within these limited choices.
Yeah. So I think, in a way, it's about freedom, but it's very realistic. It recognizes that freedom now comes with these restrictions. So it's actually a very real. It's magical, but it's also very real in the sense that it knows that these are your choices. You have to now live the most moral and the most honest life possible.
Yeah, and you have to try to be free. Whether it is in your dreams or whether it is in reading poetry, and remembering that a good poem has much more truth than the reams of bad journalism produced by your paper.
Yeah. Wonderful. It really is a wonderful novel, and it's also a novel. I would urge all of you that if you find that you don't want to enter it through one novella, you could also enter it through the second or the third, and you'll still arrive at your destination, I think. And I think that's one of the beauties of it, because we've all got so used to, binge watching series and, maybe quickly jumping to episode 3 or episode 4. It's very modern in that sense. I think you can do that with this book as well. So, and as I said, it needs to be made into a series quickly. Thank you all very much. If you don't have any questions, I'd like to end the session. And really a remarkable book. And thank you so much for talking to me. Quite honored. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaveree. Thank you for the great question.